Well, a very, very warm welcome to you guys. Hi, it's Cassim, and thank you very, very, very much for joining me in this new series that I'm going to entitle Thinking Out Loud. And I want to talk to you today on the topic of overcoming trauma. So I just want to firstly start off by saying thank you very much for joining me. Thank you so much for spending the next sort of hour or so with me. And I hope that perhaps if you're somebody who's gone through trauma, or you know somebody who's gone through trauma, or somebody who's had kind of a traumatic event happen in their life, that perhaps you might get a bit more understanding of what's happened in their life, or you might be able to get some kind of insight or direction, or a different perspective on that based on some of the things that I'm going to share with you today. And I hope in some way it can elevate your life, and in some way can help you become a higher, fuller expression of yourself. So I really want to thank you so much for joining me, and I'm really, really, really hopeful that I can share something with you today that can help you. Usual stuff, guys. If something that I share with you today you find useful and you want to support me and you want to join my community, jump on my YouTube channel Cassim and subscribe to it. That's how you can support me. Okay, so I wanted to talk to you guys about overcoming trauma. And what I basically wanted to do is, over the next hour, I just wanted to basically share with you thoughts that I have been thinking about. Things that I've been thinking about, particularly when it comes to trauma. And the reason why I wanted to share these with you is, I don't know whether you know what I've basically spent the last 6 years doing, but in case you don't know, let me just refresh you. So basically what happened was, 6 years ago, I came to kind of a climax in my life where I had a bailiff come to my mum's house. I was living with my parents at the time, and I was an estate agent, and a bailiff came to my mum's house in the daytime when I was at work, and he basically said to my mother that I was in debt. Now, my mother didn't know that I was in debt. And he said, look, we have a court order here to repossess anything that is Cassim's, and we have the right to gain access to your property because we know he lives here and he's put this as his residence, and we have the right to possess anything that's his, sell it on so that we can kind of pay off the debt. And so later on that evening, I came home. My mom was, and what basically ended up happening was that I saw my mum crying. Now, I had only ever seen my mum crying once before in my life, and that last time was the day that my biological father died. The second time that I saw my mum crying was the day that she found out that I was in debt. And, you know, they talk about the fact that mothers cry one of two tears. Mothers cry the tears of joy, or the mothers cry tears of disappointment. Unfortunately, my mum wasn't crying tears of joy because I'd graduated from university, or I'd got married, or I'd given her a grandchild or something like that. My mum was crying because something that I had done had made her so disappointed in the kind of human being that she'd raised that she could not take it. And she was ashamed because she was like, I did not really raise my son to be the kind of person who gets himself in these kinds of situations. And that was kind of a life-defining day for me, because when that day happened, when I saw my mom crying, I basically said, clearly something about what I think I know about life is wrong. I thought I had everything together. I thought that I had the answers. I thought that to have a good life, you had to work really hard and you had to be a good person. But clearly, I can't be that much of a good person because this has happened. And I know for a fact that I've been lying to my parents. And also, clearly, just simply working hard is not good enough because I've been working really hard. I've had 4 jobs at one time. So clearly something about what I think I know is not working. But I was scared, guys. And the reason why I was scared was that I came to realize that part of the reason why I didn't succeed at life was because I didn't really like successful people. Most successful people that I had heard of were either really successful, but they were corrupt, they were dickheads, they'd stepped on people to become successful, they were unhappy with their lives, they'd commit suicide, they were stressed all the time. And I was like, I don't really want to become that kind of person. So what basically I started out on the path to go and figure out on that very same night was, I wanted to answer two questions. The first question was, is it possible for a guy from Africa, from Uganda, who was born in poverty, to start from the ground and become successful? It's a very simple question. I just wanted to know, are there some people who start off as underdogs, who start off with nothing, and they raise themselves above the ideas of where they grew up, they raise themselves above the estate agents, they rise above themselves above the circumstances that they grew up in? Are there people who did that? And I wanted to know, how did they do it? That was the first question. The second question that I was curious about was, are there some people who've done that, but they did it the proper way? They did it being good people. And so the second question that I study is it possible to become successful and not end up a dickhead, and not end up stepping on everybody to get there, and not end up unhappy, and not end up divorced, and not end up stepping on everybody to get there, and when you get there, not end up committing suicide? Are there people who basically done those two things? That's what I basically wanted to know. And so in answering that very second question, I basically began to basically find people who'd started with nothing. I essentially found that there were two common characteristics that linked basically every successful person. And I would say to you the same thing. You find me somebody who is highly successful, and the two things that I'm going to tell you, all of them have in common. There are no exceptions to this rule. I've now read literally thousands of autobiographies of people who started with nothing and have rose, and every single one of these individuals has these two traits. And the first trait is that every single one of them is highly driven. Name any person who you consider to be successful, and they will tell, and you will be able to very clearly see that that person is got way more drive, way more ambition, way more reasons for doing well than most other people around them. It's not that they're more talented, it's not that they're more clever, it's not that they're better human beings, but some people on planet Earth simply are more driven and more motivated than most other people. The second trait that every single one of them has is resilience. Basically, what I began to find was that when I looked at the early part of these individuals' lives, every single one of these successful people had something traumatic happen at the beginning of their life. Right? Now, some of you will look at somebody and say, well, Cassim, they didn't have anything happen to them. But that's because they haven't told you that anything has happened to them. But I guarantee you, any person who you define to be successful, I guarantee you something happened at the beginning, at their formative part of their life, which basically gave them the second characteristic that I find amongst all successful people, which is resilience. Some people call it, what do they call it? There is another word which I read so many times in books. I can't remember the exact word. But basically, it's the ability to keep falling down and then get back up again. The ability to get knocked down and get back up again. The ability to fail and then come back again. The ability to basically just keep getting back up, keep moving forward. This ability to keep failing and keep moving forward, keep fucking up and keep moving forward, most people do not have. And so when you combine those two characteristics, where you've got somebody who wants to succeed, somebody who wants to do well, and they don't care about failing, and they don't care about looking like an idiot, and every single time they fail, they get up, you can see very quickly why somebody would very, very, very quickly succeed over other people, right? And so here was the problem. In the fact that these individuals had this ambition and drive, ultimately what they would do is that they would evade and ignore the trauma that they had experienced, because they were so busy trying to become successful and they were so busy living their better life. What they did is they ignored the trauma that happened to them. And I wrote down, as I was preparing for this, something that I found really interesting, which is this, that trauma is a time traveler. And I guess that's the first thing that I want to share with you as a thought for you to think about. Trauma is a time traveler. Most of us make the assumption that just because we've got older, that just because I'm 40 or I'm 50, that the fact that my mum abandoned me, I should be over this. Like, come on, Cass, I'm 30 years of age. I remember the fact that my parents divorced, or I remember the fact that when I was younger, my parents abandoned me. I'm 30, I should be over this, right? And most of us, we make the assumption that as we get older, that all of a sudden, we should by nature just get over stuff. Unfortunately, guys, we don't. In fact, one of the statements that I wrote down here is the mind might suppress, but the body does not. In other words, what I mean by this is that our minds are so powerful that when we go through a traumatic event in our lives, like child abuse, like being abandoned, what tends to happen is that the mind actually suppresses it from our memory because it's so painful that the mind you can't move forward, you can't do anything because it would consume your mind. So what the mind does is it basically covers it up. I love this statement that Rose Fitzgerald said. Rose Fitzgerald said this: people say that time heals all wounds. I do not agree. The wounds remain, and in time, the mind, protecting its sanity, covers them with scar tissue, and the pain lessens, but it never goes away. And isn't that so true? So many people, their parents abandoned them when they were younger, their parents beat them, their parents divorced when they were younger. When they were growing up, the child felt like they were given the burden, that they never felt good enough, that their parents constantly compared them to their brother or sister. And a lot of us, we grow older and we kind of have that pain still inside of us, but our mind has actually forgot about it because we've got children now, or we're busy with our lives, or we're successful in our business, and we've kind of forgotten about what our parents did to us. Here's what happens: our body does not actually forget. And it's always interesting when I meet people, where I've met so many people who do not get on with their parents. And I'm always like, why don't you get on with your parents? And people say, me and my mum, when I'm around her, I just get angst. I don't feel good. I don't feel safe. I get angry at her, and I don't know why I get angry at her. And what begins to get really interesting for me is trauma is so powerful that the body literally remembers it. That's why trauma is called a time traveler. The body actually remembers it, but the mind there's so many things have happened that the mind has actually forgotten about it. But the body remembers. And so when we even come into that person's presence, the body activates. The body begins to get really kind of tense, and the body acts in a certain way. And some of us, when we're around our parents, we begin to window and we begin to diminish and we begin to become passive, even though when our business or we're at work, we're actually very dominant, and we're actually we're very confrontational, and we have great leadership abilities. And so really I want to encourage you to understand that just because you're older, just because you're 30 or 40 years of age or 50 years of age, it doesn't mean that what happened to you when you were younger has all of a sudden disappeared. It's still with you. So the second thing that I was writing down that I wanted to tell you about is, healing indeed, the healing process anyway, will indeed happen naturally. Okay? It will. We know that if you've had a heartbreak, in time, the heartbreak will lessen and lessen and lessen a little bit more. I think all of us can agree with that, yeah? If you've lost your grandparents who you were really close to, or you've lost a loved one that you were really close to, we know that ultimately they never really disappear, but I'll get into that a bit later on. But we know that over time, at the beginning, the pain is so intense and is so tangible, and it's all consuming. But over time, it begins to lessen a little bit. But what I want you to, and this is the point that I want to tell you, is whilst that process will happen naturally, unfortunately, growth will not. And I think what I want to make sure that many of you understand, which is what I didn't understand, is that when you go through a traumatic event in your life, you want to be very, 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 very careful that you are conscious about growing above it. And the reason why I say this is because the trauma has a really funny way of manifesting itself in different ways. So, for example, when you have been abused as a child, or if you've been abandoned by your mum or your dad, or your parents went through divorce and you have that anger and you have that resentment, it's very easy for the resentment to turn into anger, or to turn into an addiction, or to turn into being a control freak, or becoming a perfectionist, or become somebody who is subdued, or become somebody who is arrogant. It is very easy for it to manifest itself in these ways. Or maybe you're somebody who's a shopaholic, or you're a gambler, or you're a drinker, or you love drugs. But in reality, these are all results of what's actually happening deep down. And what I want to say to you is, and this is actually something that I was learning from, I was studying Paris Hilton. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Paris Hilton's story, but she has a very fascinating story. I said to you at the beginning of this that any successful person you find, they have to have gone through something. Well, I haven't found it anyway yet. I'm yet to find somebody who is highly successful who has not had some kind of traumatic event happen at the very beginning, or the loads of dysfunction happen at the very beginning of their life. And I was studying Paris Hilton, and Paris Hilton was a really fascinating character because one of the things that Paris Hilton didn't want to do is that she didn't want to deal with her trauma. There's a film that she's actually just produced about what happened to her in her childhood that's made her kind of has influenced who she is today. And she suffers a lot from insomnia, so she can't sleep at night. Right? She only sleeps like 3 hours, 2 hours a night, which is obviously an insane amount of hours to sleep. She has nightmares where every time she sleeps, she has this recurring nightmare where somebody is dragging her, somebody is chasing her. These two men are pulling her and are dragging her, and she cannot seem to get away. And one of the things that becomes very apparent as you begin to watch this is if you do not deal with the trauma in your life, it has the ability to destroy everything else that you have. And I found this, especially when I've been doing my counseling, I found this because so many people, for example, will lose a child. One of the most devastating things anyone can ever go through. And in the fact that they are not allowing themselves to grow above the trauma, what happens is that they start misappropriating their lives, which leads to the destruction of everything else that they have. Let me give you a perfect illustration of this. Many people who lose a child, what will happen is that they will have maybe another child or 2 children or 3 children, but in the process of that grief, in the process of that trauma, they will actually neglect the other child. They will, without even thinking about it, say things like, my life can never be complete. My life will never be the same again. I might as well give up on life. And the message that they're sending to the other child, without them even realizing it, because they are in grief and they have the right to go through that grief, is that the other child will never be good enough. That the other child can never complete their parents. Can you imagine growing up and no matter what you do, your parents will always never be whole? Your parents will always use your birthday to, for example, say things like, your brother this should have been his 18th birthday. Your sister should have been graduating, right? And all of a sudden, it takes away from that person's light. It takes away from that person's moment. Many people, in the fact that they've been betrayed or that they've been cheated on, what they will do is they will go about the world and absolutely never give themselves to anyone in relationships. And what will ultimately end up happening is that they will never connect with anybody in their life. They will never truly be loved. Even if somebody comes along and genuinely that person loves them and that person wants good for them, that person will always close their heart. They will decline and refuse to be loved because they don't want to expose themselves to that hurt. They don't want to expose themselves to all those emotions again, to be disappointed. And what ultimately ends up happening is they will go into string after string after string after string of relationships where they kind of go into the relationship, but they dip out again. They get engaged, but then they do something to make the other person doubt them, and then the engagement gets called off. Right? They start dating somebody who's really good for them, but they say, well, there's something wrong with him, he's too perfect. Do you see what I mean by this? And this is what I'm talking about. In that grief or in that trauma, for example, I've dealt with a lot of people who've gone through bereavement, and what happens is they obviously start drinking. And in the refusal to deal with their emotions, to deal with the grief, what ends up happening is they start drinking. Because they start drinking, they start not performing very well at work. Because they're not performing very well at work, they now are in danger of losing their job. They eventually lose their job. They now have to live on their savings or the insurance that was paid out by their beloved one. It gets to the point where their health starts deteriorating. I know a guy who had drunk so much alcohol due to the death of his wife that what happened is that his skin started actually, what's the word that I'm looking for? Like, it started like, like a tree, when you have like a tree's got like that, it hardens, right? That's what started to happen to his skin. He had drunk so much alcohol to numb out the pain that his skin actually started to die. His skin started to peel. And this is what I talk about when I say you've got to be very careful that even though healing will take its place and it will happen over time and things will get lessen and that pain will lessen, you want to be very careful that you don't allow it to destroy everything else in your life before that you reach the process of clarity. And so what I actually recommend to you, if in case you're going through this situation or you know somebody who's going through this, is to make the decision to grow above the trauma. Now, growing above the trauma doesn't mean that you basically... Now, what did I write down here? It doesn't mean that you accept that the crisis was okay. It doesn't mean that your wife passing away, you accept that is okay, right? The fact that you decide that, do you know what? I'm going to move on, because if I don't move on, I cannot be present enough for my children. My wife has passed away. I'm the only parent my children have. If I don't grow above this, I can't be present. I can't celebrate their birthdays. I can't be present and attuned to what they need because I'm so consumed by what I'm going through and what I'm experiencing. And it is absolutely legitimate that you should be going through that and you should be experiencing that. You're human, right? I would add and just basically say that you want to grow above that process, right? And what I mean by this is you can use this as instead of, for example, going through that healing process and you're not attuned to your children, this you can use now. This is how you grow above it. You now say, my husband passed away, my missus passed away all of a sudden because of a heart attack. Everything that we'd planned together is never going to happen. We were supposed to grow old together. We were supposed to be there, both of us, our children's graduation. We're never going to be. But you know what? I my partner was so loving and desired our children to do so well that I'm going to love them twice as much on his behalf or her behalf. I am going to be there twice as present on their behalf so that I can actually carry on his memory. I can actually continue to live out his desires. You know, one of the things that I also wrote down here that I wanted to share with you guys is that I actually believe that when we firstly lose, actually, I wasn't even supposed to tell you this, because was supposed to be about another one of these lecture series that I'm supposed to talk about when it comes to death. But one of the things that I wrote down as I was doing this is, I wrote down that, what did I write down? I wrote down that when somebody who we love passes away, a part of them stays with us. As long as we love them and they loved us, a part of them always stays with us. And, you know, many people who are going to be listening to this, you've lost somebody. Your mum, your dad, a grandparent, somebody who means a lot to you. But I would challenge you to consider the fact that actually, the fact that you still remember them, you remember their image, you remember the laughs that you used to have, you remember the ridiculous jokes they used to make, you remember the nagging that they used to give you. Isn't that a representation that a part of them actually lives within you? That's what I anyway believe. You may disagree with me, but I just believe there is no way that you can love somebody and care for somebody and connect with them, and when their physical body passes on, that a part of them doesn't stay with you. I don't know, that's just something that I was thinking about. So that's one of the things that I wanted to share with you. The other thing that I particularly like to share with people when it comes to this is that crying is okay. You know, I think when many of us have gone through trauma, or we're experiencing trauma, many of us have this thought pattern of out thinking or out practicalitying the process, right? And so many people will be like, I shouldn't really be crying. It's been a year since my loved one passed away. Why am I crying? I should not be crying, right? Somebody might say, do you know what? I got abused as a child, and I actually didn't even remember it. And recently something has happened to me and it's triggered it. Why am I still angry about it? You know, when I was younger, my mother always made me really annoyed, and my mother made me, she always was more tougher towards me than she was on my brothers and sisters. And I always resented her. And I'm like 40 now. Why am I still angry at her? Why am I still frustrated at her? And she never has given me an apology. And what's worse of it is she doesn't even acknowledge it. She has no idea that I'm even frustrated with her. I mean, I'm pretty evident about it, right? I'm pretty clear that I can't connect with her, and I tell her all the time that I didn't like the way I was raised, and she still hasn't got it. And I think so many of us, we live our lives in that kind of space where we try to outthink what we're going through. We try to basically say, because I'm this age, I already have my own children. Why am I still angry about the fact that my mum didn't allow me to have my school uniform or allow me to go to a certain school? Why am I still angry about it? And so many people, try to outthink it. But I would personally recommend to you to let the healing process be the healing process, okay? Don't try to outthink it. Because one of the other things that I wrote down that I wanted to share with you is, and this particularly happens when somebody goes through a bereavement. Many people don't realize this, because you wouldn't, because most people who are listening to this, you haven't gone through a real bereavement. I mean, your mum, your dad, somebody really close to you has passed away. But if you've ever gone through this, what happens is that for the first kind of year or so, people kind of rally around you. Everybody rallies around you. Everybody looks after you. People come in and check up on you. It's actually a bit unnerving. If you've ever spoken to somebody who's lost like a loved one, they find it a bit unnerving because people keep ringing you and texting you and saying, do you want to come out? Do you want us to come over? People make food for you. People buy stuff for you. It's a really bizarre time that happens when you go through bereavement. And of course, it's one of the most traumatic events that happens for most of our lives. And what happens is that after about a year, people start basically leaving you alone. People, what did I write down as I was preparing for this? When others go back to their normal lives, it is not a deadline on your healing. So what I mean by this is when after about a year or a certain period of time happens, depending on your circumstances, what happens is that people will start to back away. Right? Because they're like, I mean, it's been a year. This person should by naturally be good. We just make these assumptions about people. We're like, it's been a year. They kind of seem all right. They've kind of going back to their normal life. And many people feel the pressure that because people are no longer texting them, people are no longer coming to their house and getting them, making them food and bringing them puddings and bringing them pickled onions, a lot of people feel the pressure that that is a sign that they should be over this, right? That they should have overcome this by now. But I have found that that's not actually true. Just because your parent passed away or your missus or a child of yours passed away a year ago and people are no longer coming to your home consistently and they've backed away, it doesn't mean that your healing process has actually finished. Because the healing process, and this is one of the things I wrote down, healing does not have a time scale. After a year, it doesn't mean that after a year, all of a sudden you should just magically be healed. Just because your parents have really mistreated you when you were younger or abandoned you, or you've gone through a really traumatic event in your life when you were younger, where perhaps your parents just left you with your grandparents and never said goodbye or anything. Just because you're now 30 with your own kids, it doesn't mean that you've healed. There is no timescale on healing. This is why I say to people that, and it's important for people to understand this, because I don't think people really get this. A lot of us, we just presume, like, we even say things so nonchalantly without even realizing them. Oh, come on, you're a grown person, just get over it. We say ridiculous statements like this, but without realizing that some of us are a lot more softer than other people. Some of us take more time. It's interesting because one of the things that I wrote down was that even though we may be of known the same person, what that person meant to us is completely different. Do you understand? So just because you have two brothers who both had the same parent and both of them lost a parent, it doesn't mean that what that parent meant to each of them is the same. Each of them, the parent means something completely different. And so after a year, when everybody's gone back to their lives, it's very easy for one of the children to be like, why, you know, imagine, you can just see it, right? 3 or 4 brothers or sisters, everybody's kind of moved back to their normal lives, and one of them is still grieving. One of them is still going to their parents' grave every single weekend. And it's so easy for the other brothers and sisters to say, just get over it. It's been a year. He's gone. She's gone. You know, people can say, like, you have 3 other children now. Just move on. Do you know what I mean? They say these really nonchalant statements without actually realizing that the person meant very different things to what they meant to you. Right? And I think that's one of the things that's really important for us to recognize, not only for ourselves, but also for other people as well. One of the things that I wrote down is that when we actually go through the healing process, we are no longer emotionally or spiritually where we used to be before. I think what I have found in my experience and from speaking to so many people now who've gone through traumatic events is it's actually really scary when you begin to grow above the trauma that you went through. And part of it is that the part of your power, part of the power that you had was the fact that it was your secret, that nobody knew about it. And this is now beginning to get really complicated, and I don't want to dove into it because there's so many layers I can go with this particular topic. But basically what happens is when you begin to actually grow above the trauma that you went through, there is a sense of lack of control in your life, because now you are having to basically, and this is why I said earlier on that when you decide to grow above the trauma, it doesn't mean that you accept that what happened is okay, right? It's really important that you understand that, because if you don't understand that or you don't get that, when I say that, for example, that when you begin to grow above what you went through, that you might have to see this situation in a completely different way. For a lot of people, what ends up happening is they really struggle with this, because it's like, well, you're basically saying, Cassim, that I have to forget the memory of my loved one. You're basically saying that I went through sexual abuse and you want me to grow above it. You're basically accepting that you want me to accept that what they did to me was okay. And for example, I give you this example because this is a common thing, particularly for men, that happens, where the control that they have was that they did not want the abuser to take away that power. They didn't even want the abuser to they would even see, some people see the person who abused them as a child consistently, but they will never say anything because that's kind of their power, it's their secret, it's their thing. And when eventually they're like, this is destroying me, I have nightmares about this, like I can't move on, I can't love, I can't really care for anybody, and I've got to the stage where I've got to outgrow this, right? I'm angry all the time. I'm frustrated all the time. I'm resentful towards people all the time. And I know that it all stems from what happened to me from that sexual abuse experience that happened to me. And so sometimes, for example, an exercise that I give people is that you want to write a letter to the person who abused you and basically say everything that you've wanted to say to them, right? Now, for a lot of people, that's really scary, guys, because it basically gives away the power to the other person, right? But unfortunately, if you run around your life like this, and you are trying to hide from everybody, and you are trying to run away from your past, and you're trying to defend yourself, and you're trying to protect yourself from the world, from other people, the issue that you have is that you can never put out your hands to what is in front of you, to what people are offering you, to the love that you have here, because you're so busy protecting yourself and defending yourself. And so that's why that process is really, really difficult. And I say this because moving away, how do I put this in a way that I'm trying to put this in a way that doesn't sound bad. So bear with me. Moving away from the trauma that happened to you and the story that you made about it, because every single one of us made, so for example, if you've gone through a trauma, a really deep trauma in your life, you might make the meaning that it's happened to you because it was your fault. Some people then come to the realization that the thing that happened was not their fault, that they had nothing to do with it, right? You know, people who lose a loved one might say things like, if I'd only been there longer, if I'd only been tougher on them, if I'd only told them not to go out that night, if I'd only called them, you know, things like somebody losing their best friend to suicide, right? And somebody might say, if only I'd paid more attention to them, and they blame themselves for the reason why that person passed away, and that literally consumes and destroys everything in their life, right? And they have to come to a point in their life where they're like, right, okay, I've got to grow above this. This doesn't mean that what happened was okay. It doesn't mean I don't miss this person. It doesn't mean I don't love them. It doesn't mean that we didn't have great memories, but I've got to grow above this. And this means that I may have to evolve in my thinking, in my spirituality, in the emotional state that I've been using to deal with this, right? So for example, some people have been so used to dysfunction and let me put this in a way that I think most of you can understand. Many people have gone, in fact, let me give you a perfect illustration. I know somebody who, when they were younger, their dad cheated on their mum, and their mum took them back all the time. Okay? This happened several times when this girl was growing up. Okay? Several times. The mum would get cheated on by the father, and then she would take the father back. And basically, obviously, I'm sure you can imagine, the message is sent to the child. So now she's growing up, and guess what her relationships are like? Because this is what she saw. Every single time that she gets into a relationship and the guy is like a good guy and the guy treats her well, do you know what she does? She self-sabotages the relationship to ensure that it mimics what she saw when she was growing up. So she will actually, if the relationship is going too well and they're getting on and they're connecting, she will do things to like deliberately make sure that they argue, or they get into an argument, or they fight, or there is chaos and there's drama, because when she was growing up, that's what she saw. So for example, for some people, obviously, that destroys everything in their life. They can never truly love. They can never truly connect with anyone. In fact, there is a rhetoric that she says all the time, which is, Cass, you can never rely on anyone. You can never trust anyone. People are liars. People are cheaters, right? Never depend on anyone, Cassim. Imagine going through your life like that. You don't trust anybody. You don't have faith in anybody. You believe everybody's going to betray you. You believe everybody's going to lie to you. You believe everybody's going to step on you. You believe even if you love somebody and you give them everything, they're still going to be an asshole to you. Imagine going through life like that. And I was speaking to her, and I was saying to her about some of the ways in which, if she wanted to move out of that, because this girl, the ironic thing is, she's actually such a loving person. She's so loving. She has so much love to give, right? That unfortunately, she's been so stuck with that kind of drama and negativity and that blueprint that her dad and her mum gave her, that it's normal for her. It's normal. That trauma and that drama and that craziness is normal for her. So for her to move from that to a space of trust, of faith, of respect, right, of relying on somebody else, is almost impossible. In fact, she would much rather be in a dysfunctional, messed up relationship because it's normal to her and it's comfortable to her than go back to the other. Some of you guys who are listening to me, for example, I learned something which was fascinating for me. I didn't know that, you know, people who cut themselves, so they cut their wrists or they cut their arms or whatever. I didn't know that when they do this, it's actually a form of control. I found out I was speaking to people who'd cut themselves, because I was obviously fascinated by why somebody would cut themselves. And they were saying to me that when they cut themselves, they feel control and they have power over who sees it. I didn't know that when people are dealing with anorexia, right, that they actually, the fact that they can control their weight is where they get control, right? And this was fascinating for me. And they were explaining to me that one of the hardest things that they go through is letting go of that. Because when you let go of the food and you allow your body to go back to how its natural state and its natural equilibrium, you no longer have control over your body, because sometimes your weight might be 52 kilograms, sometimes it might be 58 kilograms, right? Sometimes it might be 48. It fluctuates, right? Sometimes you have good days, sometimes you have bad days. That's actually how things, your body should be. But trying to keep your body at 51.1 every single time of the year and starving yourself and vomiting yourself if you get to 51.2 is insane, right? But you can see where that control comes in. And so my point to you, and I've taken a long way to get to the point of what I'm trying to get to, is when you eventually go through that process of healing, of actually growing above your trauma, it's going to be very difficult, because you will not be in the same emotional or spiritual state. The other thing that I wanted to share with you as well is trauma will adapt and change so as to survive. Until you take care of it, it will manifest itself in anger, in indifference, in perfectionism. Many people do not realize that if you do not deal with your trauma, if you do not deal with the hurt, with the suffering that you're experiencing, it will actually manifest itself in different ways. So for example, have you ever met somebody who's like really angry all the time? And you're like, why are you so angry all the time? I don't get it. Like, you have a good job, you're very good looking, you're healthy, but you're just so angry all the time. Have you ever met somebody who's like that? And it kind of, everybody who knows them just knows them for being angry. Well, that's actually originates from what's called a temperament, right? Where, again, without me getting too deep into this, if we go follow it back, basically that person got hurt at some point, and that person then didn't deal with the hurt, and eventually it led to the point where they became resentful, they became hopeless, they became angry, etc., etc., etc. And so many people, you meet people who are in these circumstances and who are in these situations because they just didn't deal with the trauma, they didn't deal with their suffering, they didn't deal with their hurt. And personally, what I would recommend to you, and this is my personal opinion to you, is be really careful to not look at the end product as the cause. I recently did, actually, I think I did, as I was talking about this in my workshop, where I was saying that if you have a fire alarm go off in your house, the problem is not the fire alarm. And a lot of people will think that if there's a fire alarm going off in their house, then the fire alarm is the issue and it's making loads of noise. The fire alarm isn't actually the problem, right? Because the fire alarm is only a product. It is a byproduct of something else. If we followed it backwards and we looked at why is a fire alarm going off, we would find that there must be smoke, because fire alarms only go off when there is some kind of smoke. It detects smoke. If we follow the smoke back, we would look that somewhere in the house, somewhere around the kitchen, there is a fire which is burning. Now, we then follow that back. Why is it? Oh, it's a kettle that's boiled too much. Oh, a piece of a proofing paper has started to burn. Do you see what I mean? If we follow it back. So actually, the origin and the problem of the reason why the fire alarm is going off is actually the fact that there is a fire. And what I want to encourage you to really be very careful of is not to fall for the fact that the fire alarm is going off. Do not look at yourself and your anger and you think that that is a problem. Anger is a result. And people do not just become angry. People are triggered by something which makes them angry. If you're finding in your life that you're somebody who's really negative, negativity is a result. If you are finding, for example, that you're somebody who is in debt all the time. In fact, do you know what? Let me give you a perfect example, because I like to make things relatable to me. One of the things that I had to really look at in my life is I had to look at why, basically, I know a lot of people, but very few people know me. right? I know a lot of people. I could, if I'm telling you, if I went into a room and I'd never been in the room, and we all went into a room and we'd never been in the room, if we spent an hour in that room and we came out of that room and we interviewed people about the people who they'd met, I would know more stuff about people in that room, who they were, what their names were, how many children that they have, where they were born, what they like to eat. I would know more about them. Now, if you ask them to tell them about me, they would know very little about me. And in my life, that's actually the way my life has always been. My life has always been that I know a lot about people, how to help them, how to give to them. But I got to a point in my life where I basically realized very few people know Cassim. Very few people know me. And I was like, why is that? Why do a lot of people not know me? And basically I always thought that the problem was, here's now what I thought was a problem. I always thought the problem is, I spend so much time asking about other people and asking about their problems and asking what they're interested in that they never ask about me. See, that is a cover-up. That's like me saying that the fire alarm is the cause of the problem. But when I actually went back and really dug down and looked at myself, I found out that I have a real problem with trusting people. So let me tell you a bit of a story. When I was 7 years of age, let me go even further back. So my mum got pregnant at 14 years of age and she had me at 15. My biological father basically found out that she was pregnant and disappeared off the face of the planet. In fact, I didn't actually get to meet my biological father until years later when I came to England, and he was living in London. But he didn't know me, he knew nothing about me. In other words, he'd abandoned me. Now, as a child, I didn't even know what abandonment was. I didn't know what it meant to a child when their biological parent isn't there. But to a child, if your biological parent isn't there, particularly your father, because that's how you learn how to be a man. A guy learns how to be a man from his father. I found out that if you do not grow up with your biological father, what ends up happening is that you believe, and without realizing it, you believe that two things. Number one, that you're not enough, that there is something wrong with you, and number two, that the person doesn't love you. Because if your own biological father cannot be there and they cannot love you and they cannot accept you, how can anybody else accept you? And so one of the things that I know I am very bad at is being a people pleaser. I love getting people's affirmation. It is part of the reason that led me to being in debt. The desire to get people's affirmation and people's acceptance is... that's why I'm a bit of a chameleon. I'm a bit of a chameleon because I can fit anywhere, because when I was growing up, I was so keen to be liked and so keen to be accepted that I was prepared to become anybody and anything to be liked, right? In fact, many people, particularly black people, say to me, Cassim, why do you speak so posh, right? Because when I was growing up, without me even realizing it, I basically learned that in order for me to fit in with white people or with my white friends, I needed to be able to speak like they spoke, right? And most of them had good English and could articulate English. They didn't speak like, yo, all right, mate, how's it going? Yo, yeah, brav, yeah. They didn't speak like that, right? Now, that's okay if you know black people, but I spent the predominant huge amount of my time around a white school and with a white environment. So I needed to know how to fit in. Now, so on top of this, one of the other things that happened in my life and again, this is me looking really deep at my life. The other thing that happened in my life was that when I was, how old was I? I was 7 years of age. My mum left me, 8 years of age. 7 or 8 years of age, my mum left me in Uganda to move to England because my mum did not have enough money to pay for a British passport for me and to pay for the ticket to bring me to England. So my mum had to come to the UK, to England, to Exeter, work in a factory, whilst working in super drugs at the same time to basically save money to pay for me. Now, I do not remember. This is how messed up this really is, because I didn't even think that that was a traumatic event that happened in my life. But what basically, as a child, I developed is that people are going to leave you. That no matter how much people love you, they're never really going to be there for you. So you can give a lot to people, but you can't really ever give yourself fully to people because they're going to leave you. So when you combine that along with my biological father, can you now start to see that I always really was keen to spend so much time finding out about other people that nobody ever found out about me, because I was so scared that if they found out about me, they'd leave me, they'd abandon me, they wouldn't accept me. Do you see what I'm saying? And this is how deep some of this stuff begins to become when you start looking at it. Because as I say, it is very, very easy to look at somebody who is an alcoholic, for example, and think, well, the reason their problem is they're an alcoholic. No, it isn't. People do not just become alcoholic for no reason. Something in there happened. Alcohol, what does alcohol do? Alcohol suppresses something, which means they're experiencing some kind of pain to the degree that they would rather consume alcohol that could kill them than feel the pain that they were consuming. Do you see what I mean? And so that's the other thing that I wanted to share with you. And I think that kind of ends some of the things that I wanted to share with you, because we're coming up to kind of an hour. There is so many other things that I wanted to share with you about healing that I've learned that I think are really important for you guys to know. But that's just some of the things that I've been thinking about, and I really wanted to try and get these out to you guys to try and add some value into your life, and maybe perhaps to help you see something that's slightly a bit different. I don't know. This is, you know, guys, I have learned to really start following my instincts, to really start following my gut. If my gut is telling me that this is what I should be doing, I've learned to just go with it. I know to some of you this may be like a really random video and a really random lecture to have, but to somebody else this might be really useful. So that's why I thought I'd do it. But anyway, I hope that it's, I don't know, maybe thought something for you to think, giving you some thought or something to think about. Maybe helped you see certain trauma is slightly a bit different. But to really conclude, what I would ask you to do is, I would ask you to look at your own trauma, right? I would ask you to look at, if you are somebody who is driven and you are somebody who's resilient, I would ask you to ask whether you've dealt with the trauma in your life, whether you've dealt with it. Because if you don't deal with it, and you do what many people do, which is that I worry about it when I'm older, I worry about it when I'm successful, I'm telling you, you could leave it so late that it will destroy everything in your life. That's what I would recommend to you. But ultimately, it's your life. You've got to do whatever you want. If you like what I said, guys, you know what to do. Jump on my YouTube channel, subscribe to it to help me support me. Thank you so much for watching. Have a very, very good week, and I shall speak to you soon. Bye for now.